Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking into something pretty major, a real shift maybe, in the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah, it's this news about Germany offering to help Ukraine produce its own long-range weapons. It goes beyond just, another aid delivery.
Exactly. And we've got a stack of sources to unpack here. Recent news from Kyiv Independent, AP, BBC, Al Jazeera.
Plus that big Supriya report on arms transfers that just came out, and an older but actually very relevant strategic paper from ASPI digging into the history.
Right. So our mission, as always, is to cut through all that, pull out the key insights, the things you really need to grasp to feel properly informed. Think of it as, well, your shortcut to understanding what's really going on.
Okay, let's get into it.
So let's start with the immediate news. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz met with President Zelensky in Berlin. What was the core promise?
The big thing was Germany saying it will help Ukraine develop and, crucially, produce its own long-range missile systems.
And the really critical detail here.
That these systems, because they're domestically produced, wouldn't have the same kind of restrictions on their use or targets that Western-supplied weapons sometimes come with.
Oh, okay.
Merz was pretty clear. He said it would allow Ukraine to defend itself fully, and that includes hitting military targets outside Ukraine's own borders.
This feels like it must be a direct response to Ukraine's needs, right? We keep hearing Western arms supplies are stretched, they're running thin.
Absolutely. And it's pushed Ukraine to really ramp up its own production, things like ballistic missiles, those drone missile hybrid things we've seen.
Yeah. So there was all that buzz recently about Germany maybe finally sending their Taurus missiles, those long-range ones everyone's been talking about.
Right, yeah. Merz himself had made a comment back in May, I think, saying range restrictions on weapons delivered to Ukraine had been lifted. That really got people hoping for Taurus.
But then, when he's actually standing there with Zelensky, the conversation shifted. It wasn't, we'll send you Taurus. It was, we'll help you make something similar.
Exactly. Merz specifically said they wanted to talk about production and wouldn't discuss the details publicly.
That feels significant. Why the shift?
Well, it likely taps into that whole political sensitivity around Taurus. You remember former Chancellor Scholz was really, really hesitant.
Yeah, worried about Germany getting dragged directly into strikes on Russia.
Precisely. And Putin's warnings haven't helped, saying Western long-range weapons used inside Russia puts NATO at war. So this production offer, it could be a way to give Ukraine that capability without Germany directly supplying the finished missile for those specific strikes. Kind of navigating a tricky line.
Makes sense. But even with that caution on delivering Taurus, Germany's still a huge player here.
Oh, absolutely. They're the second biggest individual military aid supplier after the U.S. The commitment is massive.
Still, is there a risk this production help comes too late?
Well, that's a point some experts are making. Like John Foreman, cited in Al Jazeera, suggested even if Taurus were sent now, it might be more symbolic.
Why is that?
He argues Russia's adapted. They're not just sitting there waiting. They're using dispersal, better air defenses, camouflage, making those long-range strikes harder than they might have been earlier. Things change fast.
Okay, so this German offer, it arrives at a really tense moment. Peace talks seem stalled. Lots of talk about a potential Russian summer offensive.
Yeah, the fighting is still incredibly fierce along that huge 1,000-kilometer front line. And Ukraine is facing a real manpower shortage compared to Russia.
What are the numbers looking like?
Well, Zelensky recently said Russia's mobilizing something like 45,000 men a month. Ukraine, meanwhile, is managing around 25,000 to 27,000. That's a significant gap.
And the deep strikes are continuing, aren't they? Both ways.
Definitely. Russia just launched another big barrage ballistic missiles, probably Iskander-M or maybe those North Korean KN-23s, plus scores of Shahed drones. Zelensky said over 900 drones were launched by Russia in just 3 days recently.
Wow. And Ukraine's hitting back, too.
Oh, yeah. They've been conducting these large drone attacks deep inside Russia, often targeting energy facilities, things like that.
And the ground situation, particularly in the Northeast.
Seems very tough. Russian pressure is increasing there. Zelensky also mentioned Moscow is apparently gathering over 50,000 troops near the Sumy region border.
For what purpose?
The suggestion is maybe to try and create those security buffer zones inside Ukraine that Putin has talked about wanting along the border.
And what about the U.S. angle in all this?
Well, there are reports, that someone like former President Trump is getting impatient with Putin over the stalled peace efforts. He apparently called a recent deadly strike playing with fire.
How did Russia respond?
The Russian officials basically said Trump wasn't fully briefed. Standard pushback. But it's interesting, Zelensky has apparently discussed potential future U.S. sanctions with Trump, targeting Russia's banks and energy sector as possible leverage if things don't change.
Okay, so that's the immediate picture. Let's zoom out now. The global arms trade. Because this war has really shaken things up there, this CyPri report data here is, it's pretty stark.
It really is. What jumps out first is, while the total volume of global arms deals was kind of stable in the last 5 years compared to the 5 before that, actually down just a tiny bit,
Okay.
arms transfers to Europe just exploded, up by 155%, a massive increase.
And where does Ukraine fit into that European picture?
Ukraine became the world's single biggest arms importer in that 2020-2024 period, the largest.
That's number one.
Yep. Accounting for almost 9% of all global imports. And get this. The report says Ukraine's imports increased nearly 100 times over compared to the previous 5 years. That's a 9,627% increase.
That's hard to even comprehend. Just shows the scale of the aid effort.
Exactly. It's almost entirely down to aid received after the full-scale invasion started in 2022.
So if imports are shifting that dramatically, what about the exporters? Who's selling?
The U.S. is still way out in front. Top exporter, supplying 107 different countries, holds about 43% of the global market share.
Okay, no surprise there. But what about Russia?
That's the other side of the coin. Russia's arms exports basically crashed. They fell by 64%.
64%. Wow.
Yeah, it pushed them down into third place globally. They're now behind France, actually, whose exports went up by about 11%.
Why did Russia's exports just plummet like that?
Well, it's a mix of things. The decline actually started a bit before 2022 because some big traditional customers like China and India were already starting to buy less.
Right.
But the huge drop since 2022, that's likely because, 1, Russia needs all the weapons it can get for its own war. 2, sanctions are hitting their production and ability to trade. And 3, there's a lot of international pressure, especially from the U.S. and allies, telling other countries not to buy Russian arms.
Or are those traditional buyers finding new suppliers?
It looks like it. India is a key example. They were historically a huge customer for Russia, took 55% of Russia's exports in 2015-19.
And now?
That dropped to 38% in the latest period.
Yep.
And India is increasingly buying from France, Israel, the U.S., diversifying away.
And all this data, it really underscores how much Europe is relying on the U.S. right now, militarily speaking.
Absolutely. The U.S. accounted for over half, 53% of all arms imports into Europe in 2020-24. That's up significantly from 41% in the previous period. It shows a really deepening arms relationship, especially between the U.S. and European NATO members.
Okay, let's bring it back to Germany specifically now, but look inside the country. What do ordinary Germans think about all this support for Ukraine? There was that Wallen Group survey for ZDF television.
Yeah, the findings are quite interesting. Overall, there's solid support. 2/3, 67% of Germans back providing arms to Ukraine.
How does that break down?
Well, 27% actually want more support, and another 40% want to keep it at the current level. So combined, that's the 67%. Only about 27% want to reduce the weapon supplies.
So this whole narrative, you sometimes hear about Ukraine fatigue setting in among the public. Maybe that's overstated.
That's what some experts suggest. Yana Pugliarin, a security analyst, commented on the survey saying it shows that fatigue, while maybe talked about by politicians, isn't really reflected strongly in the public attitude yet.
Were there any regional splits?
Yes, a noticeable one. Support is higher in Western Germany, around 70% compared to 53% in Eastern Germany. Still a majority in the East, but lower.
Interesting. And what about peacekeeping?
The survey also found strong support, 69% for German troops taking part in a future peacekeeping mission if a ceasefire is reached. That's quite a high number.
And this survey was fairly recent.
Yeah, late January 2025, they spoke to over 1,400 voters, randomly selected, so pretty robust data.
Okay, so we've got the breaking news on production, the battlefield situation, the global arms shifts, German public opinion. Now, to really understand the depth here, we need that historical and geopolitical context. That's where the ASPI report comes in, the one by Paul Dibb from back in September 2022. It's older, but the insights feel very relevant.
Definitely. It really emphasizes how, for many in the Russian elite, this isn't just about territory now. It's rooted in this long-held view that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are basically one people, part of a shared history and culture.
Putin himself laid that out pretty explicitly, didn't he, in that 2021 article on the historical unity?
Exactly, where he basically argued modern Ukraine is just an artificial creation of the Soviet era, sort of ignoring distinct Ukrainian nationalism and key historical events like the Holodomor or the terrible famine in the 1930s.
The report even dives into deeper history.
Yeah, it references historians like Simon Sebag Montefiore talking about Catherine the Great and Potemkin in the 1700s, viewing southern and eastern Ukraine as new Russia, founding cities like Mariupol, Sevastopol, Kherson.
Places very much in the news now.
Precisely. But the report is careful to add that Ukrainians have a very different interpretation of that period. They see it as colonization, not liberation or shared destiny.
So viewed through that historical lens, what does the ASPI report see as Russia's core war aims? Beyond the immediate battlefield.
Fundamentally, it argues it's about restoring Russia's perceived status as a great power, about overcoming what they saw as the humiliation after the Cold War ended.
But the irony, as the report notes,
is that the invasion itself has absolutely trashed Russia's international reputation. Kind of the opposite effect in many ways.
And how does NATO expansion fit into this Russian historical view?
It's seen consistently by Putin and others as a major provocation, a sign the West wasn't respecting Russia as a major power.
And NATO has moved closer.
Oh, yes. The report notes NATO moved about 1,800 kilometers closer since the Cold War. But again, the paradox. Putin's actions, aimed at pushing NATO back, directly caused Finland and Sweden to join NATO, adding another 1,300 kilometers to NATO's border with Russia.
The report also looked back at Russia's military performance early in the full-scale invasion.
Right, and it noted how surprised many experts were by how poorly Russia performed initially. Remember, the expectation was a quick victory.
What reasons did it give?
Things like poor equipment maintenance, maybe corruption leading to missing components, really ineffective logistics, poor communications, command problems, a whole range of issues. And on the flip side, it highlighted how effective Ukrainian resistance was, using things like guerrilla tactics very well.
Now, the huge question the ASPI report tackled, how might this war end?
It presented different viewpoints. It did. It mentioned Lawrence Friedman, the strategic studies expert, who argued early on that Putin couldn't win militarily what he wanted politically. Friedman predicted some kind of negotiated end, with Ukraine emerging independent.
But the report's author, Paul Dibb, had some caveats.
Yeah, Dibb noted that pre-war Ukraine wasn't exactly a perfect democracy itself, and he was skeptical about Friedman's other prediction that the war would lead to regime change in Moscow. Dibb pointed to Putin's support outside the big cities, the power of state TV.
So what was Dibb's own view on the ending?
He seemed to doubt either side could achieve a truly decisive military victory, leaning towards a negotiated conclusion as most likely. But again, he disagreed strongly with the idea that Putin's regime was on the verge of collapse, seeing his grip as firmer than some Western observers thought.
And then there was Walter Russell Mead's perspective mentioned. How did that differ?
Mead framed Ukraine as absolutely central, like the heart of the matter. He argued that without Ukraine, Russia's whole dream of being a superpower dies. That this poses an existential challenge not just to Putin, but to the whole idea of Russian exceptionalism, the idea that strongman rule is best for Russia. Meaning, Mead suggested, it might be psychologically almost impossible for them to accept defeat until every last ruthless option has been tried, a much bleaker potential outlook.
And the report placed this conflict within a bigger shift in the world order.
Yes, it saw it as highlighting this potential confrontation between authoritarian land-based powers, thinking mainly China and Russia, and the Western democratic maritime states. It viewed Russia's invasion as a direct threat to European security, making managing that confrontation a critical long-term issue.
Which naturally leads to the Russia-China relationship. How did the report frame that?
It suggested they share a fundamental worldview, this idea of a weak, decadent, decaying West. That shared view makes their alignment, whether you call it a formal alliance or just convenience, a pretty dangerous scenario, potentially challenging U.S. alliances.
Alliance or convenience? What did the report lean towards?
It acknowledged the arguments for convenience, historical mistrust, border issues, cultural differences, but Dibb seemed to emphasize focusing on the shared elements, the authoritarian leaders, the mutual disdain for the West, the shared grievances against the current world order.
What about the impact of Western sanctions?
The report highlighted how unprecedented they were in terms of coordination and economic pain inflicted. It also noted that China, while echoing Russia's rhetoric about NATO being provocative, has actually been quite careful not to get caught seriously breaking those sanctions.
Interesting tightrope walk for Beijing.
Yeah. And the report mentioned Bobo Lo, another analyst, who observed that the war has really tilted the balance of power within the Russia-China relationship, making Moscow much more the junior partner to Beijing.
And looking further ahead, the report even speculated about the future of Russia itself.
It did. It raised the possibility of Russia becoming severely weakened, isolated, made even smaller geographically in the long run, due to the war's immense costs, the ongoing sanctions, demographic problems.
That prolonged death throes of the Russian Empire idea from Meade.
Exactly. But here's a really important, unsettling counterpoint Dib added. A weakened Russia isn't necessarily a less dangerous Russia. It could potentially become more unpredictable, more dangerous in its decline.
That's a sobering thought. Did the report offer any other strategic perspectives? Henry Kissinger was mentioned.
Yes, Kissinger's view was included. He argued that at the end of the war, whenever that is, you have to find a place for both Ukraine and Russia in the European structure. The danger, he argued, was letting Russia become just an outpost of China.
Sort of classic balance of power thinking.
Kind of. He warned against letting the war for Ukraine's freedom turn into a war against Russia itself. He acknowledged Russia's historical role in Europe, but questioned whether today's Russia could still fulfill that role constructively.
And finally, there was a brief mention of Australia in that ASPI report.
Yeah, just noting that since the Cold War ended, expertise on Russia in Australia had kind of faded. It recommended putting more effort into understanding Russia, including the Russia-China dynamic and Russia's arms sales in the Indo-Pacific region. There was even a picture included showing an Australian Bushmaster vehicle given to Ukraine, painted with "United with Ukraine," a little symbol of that global connection.
Wow, okay. That really brings together so many different threads. We've gone from, specific announcement about weapons production.
All the way through the current fighting, the massive shifts in global arms flows, how people in Germany feel about it, and these really deep historical currents and geopolitical calculations.
By looking across all these sources, the news flashes, the hard data, the opinion polls, the strategic history, you really get a sense of how complex this all is. Germany's offer isn't just a one-off decision.
No, it's woven into the immediate battlefield needs, the changing global arms market, domestic politics back home, and these centuries-old narratives about Russia's identity and place in the world. Hopefully you feel like you've got that richer, multi-layered picture now.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something to chew on, something that really stood out from that ASPI analysis. Those contrasting ideas about Russia's future.
Right. The possibility of decline versus the warning that a weakened Russia might actually become more dangerous.
Exactly. So the final thought for you is, if that's a real possibility, a major power declining but potentially becoming more unpredictable, what does that mean for the long-term challenge facing the West? How do you even manage that? What stands out most to you from everything we've unpacked today?